The Story of Civilization, Volume 1, Our Oriental Heritage, Part 2, by Will Durant, continued, Cassette 8, Side 1. Just as Shankara, in 8th century India, had brought into an intellectual system the scattered insights of the Upanishads, and had made the Vedanta philosophy supreme, and just as Aquinas in 13th century Europe was soon to weave Aristotle and St. Paul into the victorious scholastic philosophy, so Chu Shi in 12th century China took the loose apothegms of Confucius and built upon them a system of philosophy orderly enough to satisfy the taste of a scholarly age and strong enough to preserve for 7 centuries the leadership of the Confucians in the political and intellectual life of the Chinese. The essential philosophic controversy of the time centered upon the interpretation of a passage in the Great Learning quoted earlier, attributed by both Chu Shi and his opponents to Confucius. What was meant by the astonishing demand that the ordering of states should be based upon the proper regulation of the family, that the regulation of the family should be based upon the regulation of one's self, that the regulation of one's self depended upon sincerity of thought, and that sincerity of thought arose from the utmost extension of knowledge through the investigation of things? Chu Shi answered that this meant just what it said, that philosophy, morals, and statesmanship should begin with a modest study of realities. He accepted without protest the positivistic bent of the master's mind, and though he labored over the problems of ontology at greater length than Confucius might have approved, he arrived at a strange combination of atheism and piety which might have interested the sage of Shantung. Like the Book of Changes, which has always dominated the metaphysics of the Chinese, Chu Shi recognized a certain strident dualism in reality, everywhere the yang and the yin, activity and passivity, motion and rest, mingled like male and female principles, working on the 5 elements of water, fire, earth, metal, and wood to produce the phenomena of creation. And everywhere Li and Qi, law and matter, equally external, cooperated to govern all things and gave them form. But over all these forms and combining them was Tai Chi, the absolute, the impersonal law of laws, or structure of the world. Chu Shi identified this absolute with the Tian, or heaven, of orthodox Confucianism. God, in his view, was a rational process without personality or figurable form. Nature is nothing else than law. This law of the universe is also, said Chu, the law of morals and of politics. Morality is harmony with the laws of nature, and the highest statesmanship is the application of the laws of morality to the conduct of a state. Nature in every ultimate sense is good, and the nature of men is good. To follow nature is the secret of wisdom and peace. Choi Mao Shu refrained from clearing away the grass from in front of his window, because, he said, its impulse is just like my own. One might conclude that the instincts are also good, and that one may follow them gaily, but Chu Shi denounces them as the expression of matter, Qi, and demands their subjection to reason and law, Li. It is difficult to be at once a moralist and a logician. There were contradictions in this philosophy, but these did not disturb its leading opponent, the gentle and peculiar Ming. For Wang was a saint as well as a philosopher. The meditative spirit and habits of Mahayana Buddhism had sunk deeply into his soul. It seemed to him that the great error in Chu Shi was not one of morals, but one of method. The investigation of things, he felt, should begin not with the examination of the external universe, but, as the Hindus had said, with the far profounder and more revealing world of the inner self. Not all the physical science of all the centuries would ever explain a bamboo shoot or a grain of rice. In former years I said to my friend Qian, if to be a sage or a virtuous man one must investigate everything under heaven, how can at present any man possess such tremendous power? Pointing to the bamboos in front of the pavilion, I asked him to investigate them and see. Both day and night Qian entered into an investigation of the principles of the bamboo. For 3 days he exhausted his mind and thought until his mental energy was tired out and he took sick. At first I said that it was because his energy and strength were insufficient. Therefore I myself undertook to carry on the investigation. Day and night I was unable to understand the principles of the bamboo, until after 7 days I also became ill because of having wearied and burdened my thoughts. In consequence, we mutually sighed and said, we cannot be either sages or virtuous men. So Wang Ming put aside the examination of things, and put aside even the classics of antiquity. To read one's own heart and mind in solitary contemplation seemed to him to promise more wisdom than all objects and all books. Exiled to a mountainous wilderness inhabited by barbarians and infested with poisonous snakes, he made friends and disciples of the criminals who had escaped to those parts. He taught them philosophy, cooked for them, and sang them songs. Once at the midnight watch he startled them by leaping from his cot and crying out ecstatically, "My nature, of course, is sufficient. I was wrong in looking for principles in things and affairs." His comrades were not sure that they followed him, but slowly he led them on to his idealistic conclusion. The mind itself is the embodiment of natural law. Is there anything in the universe that exists independent of the mind? Is there any law apart from the mind? He did not infer from this that God was a figment of the imagination. On the contrary, he conceived of the deity as a vague but omnipresent moral force, too great to be merely a person, and yet capable of feeling sympathy and anger toward men. From this idealistic starting point he came to the same ethical principles as Chu Shi. Nature is the highest good, and the highest excellence lies in accepting the laws of nature completely. When it was pointed out to him that nature seems to include snakes as well as philosophers, he replied with a touch of Aquinas, Spinoza, and Nietzsche that good and bad are prejudices, terms applied to things according to their advantage or injury to one's self or mankind. Nature itself, he taught, is beyond good and evil, and ignores our egoistic terminology. A pupil reports or invents a dialogue which might have been entitled Jenseits von Gut und Böse. A little later he said, "This view of good and evil has its source in the body and is probably mistaken." I was not able to comprehend. The teacher said, "The purpose of heaven in bringing forth is even as in the instance of flowers and grass. In what way does it distinguish between good and evil? If you, my disciple, take delight in seeing the flowers, then you will consider flowers good and grass bad. If you desire to use the grass, you will in turn consider the grass good. This type of good and evil has its source in the likes and dislikes of your mind. Therefore I know that you are mistaken." I said, "In that case there is neither good nor evil, is there?" The teacher said, "The tranquility resulting from the dominance of natural law is a state in which no discrimination is made between good and evil, while the stirring of the passion nature is a state in which both good and evil are present. If there are no stirrings of the passion nature, there is neither good nor evil, and this is what is called the highest good." I said, "In that case good and evil are not at all present in things?" He said, "They are only in your mind." It was well that Wang in Buddhism sounded this subtle note of an idealistic metaphysic in the halls of the correct and prim Confucians. For though these scholars had the justest view of human nature and government which philosophy had yet conceived, they were a trifle enamored of their wisdom, and had become an intellectual bureaucracy irksome and hostile to every free and creatively erring soul. If in the end the followers of Chu Shi won the day, if his tablet was placed with high honors in the same hall with that of the master himself, and his interpretation of the classics became a law to all orthodox thought for 700 years, it was indeed a victory of sound and simple sense over the disturbing subtleties of the metaphysical mind. But a nation, like an individual, can be too sensible, too prosaically sane and unbearably right. It was partly because Chu Shi and Confucianism triumphed so completely that China had to have her revolution. 2. Bronze, lacquer, and jade. The role of art in China, textiles, furniture, jewelry, fans, the making of lacquer, the cutting of jade, some masterpieces in bronze, Chinese sculpture. The pursuit of wisdom and the passion for beauty are the two poles of the Chinese mind, and China might loosely be defined as philosophy and porcelain. As the pursuit of wisdom meant to China no airy metaphysic, but a positive philosophy aiming at individual development and social order, so the passion for beauty was no esoteric aestheticism, no dilettante concoction of art forms irrelevant to human affairs, but an earthly marriage of beauty and utility, a practical resolve to adorn the objects and implements of daily life. Until it began to yield its own ideals to Western influence, China refused to recognize any distinction between the artist and the artisan, or between the artisan and the worker. Nearly all industry was manufacture, and all manufacture was handicraft. Industry, like art, was the expression of personality in things. Hence, China, while neglecting to provide its people through large-scale industry with conveniences common in the West, excelled every country in artistic taste and the multiplication of beautiful objects for daily use. From the characters in which he wrote to the dishes from which he ate, the comfortable Chinese demanded that everything about him should have some aesthetic form, and evidence in its shape and texture the mature civilization of which it was a symbol and a part. It was during the Sung dynasty that this movement to beautify the person, the temple, and the home reached its highest expression. It had been a part of the excellence of Tang life and would remain and spread under later dynasties. But now a long period of order and prosperity nourished every art and gave to Chinese living a grace and adornment which it had never enjoyed before. In textiles and metalworking, the craftsmen of China, during and after the Sung era, reached a degree of perfection never surpassed. In the cutting of jade and hard stones, they went beyond all rivals anywhere, and in the carving of wood and ivory they were excelled only by their pupils in Japan. Furniture was designed in a variety of unique and uncomfortable forms. Cabinet makers, living on a bowl of rice per day, sent forth one objet de vertu, one little piece of perfection after another. And these minor products of a careful art, taking the place of expensive furniture and luxuries in homes, gave to their owners a pleasure which in the Occident only connoisseurs can know. Jewelry was not abundant, but it was admirably cut. Women and men cooled themselves with ornate fans of feathers or bamboo, of painted paper or silk. Even beggars brandished elegant fans as they plied their ancient trade. The art of lacquer began in China and came to its fullest perfection in Japan. In the Far East, lacquer is the natural product of a tree indigenous to China, the Rus vernicifera, but now most sedulously cultivated by the Japanese. Lacquer is from the French lacre, resin, which in turn derives from the Latin lac, lac, or milk. The sap is drawn from trunk and branches, strained and heated to remove excess liquid. It is applied to thin wood, sometimes to metal or porcelain, and is dried by exposure to moisture. 20 or 30 coats, each slowly dried and painstakingly polished, are laid on, the applications varying in color and depth. Then, in China, the finished lacquer is carved with a sharp V-shaped tool, each incision reaching to such a layer as to expose the color required by the design. The art grew slowly. It began as a form of writing upon bamboo strips. The material was used in the Zhou dynasty to decorate vessels, harness, carriages, etc. In the 2nd century A.D. it was applied to buildings and musical instruments. Under the Tang, many lacquered articles were exported to Japan. Under the Sung, all branches of the industry took their definite form and shipped their products to such distant ports as India and Arabia. Under the Ming emperors, the art was further perfected and in some phases reached its zenith. Under the enlightened Manchu rulers Kangxi and Qianlong, great factories were built and maintained by imperial decree, and made such masterpieces as Qianlong's throne, or the lacquered screen that Kangxi presented to Leopold I, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. The art continued at its height until the 19th century, when the wars brought on by European merchants and the poor taste of European importers and clients caused the withdrawal of imperial support, lowered the standards, debased the designs, and left the leadership in lacquer to Japan. Jade is as old as Chinese history, for it is found in the most ancient graves. The earliest records attribute its use as a sound stone to 2500 B.C. Jade was cut in the form of a fish or elsewise and suspended by a thong. When properly cut and struck, it emitted a clear musical tone, astonishingly long sustained. The word was derived through the French jade from the Spanish illada, Latin ilia, meaning loins. The Spanish conquerors of America found that the Mexicans used the stone, powdered and mixed with water, as a cure for many internal disorders, and they brought this new prescription back to Europe along with American gold. The Chinese word for the stone is much more sensible. Jun means soft, like the dew. 2 minerals provide jade, jadeite and nephrite, silicates in the one case of aluminum and sodium, in the other of calcium and magnesium. Both are tough. The pressure of 50 tons is sometimes required to crush a 1-inch cube. Large pieces are usually broken by being subjected in quick succession first to extreme heat and then to cold water. The ingenuity of the Chinese artist is revealed in his ability to bring lustrous colors of green, brown, black, and white out of these naturally colorless materials, and in the patient obstinacy with which he varies the forms, so that in all the world's collections of jade, barring buttons, no 2 pieces are alike. Examples begin to appear as far back as the Shang dynasty in the shape of a jade toad used in divine sacrifice, and forms of great beauty were produced in the days of Confucius. While various peoples used jadeite for axes, knives, and other utensils, the Chinese held the stone in such reverence that they kept it almost exclusively for art. They regarded it as more precious than silver or gold or any jewelry. They valued some small jades, like the thumb rings worn by the mandarins, at $5,000, and some jade necklaces at $100,000. Collectors spent years in search of a single piece. It has been estimated that an assemblage of all existing Chinese jades would form a collection unrivaled by any other material. Bronze is almost as old as jade in the art of China, and even more exalted in Chinese reverence. Legend tells how the ancient Emperor Yu, hero of the Chinese flood, cast the metals sent him as tribute by the 9 provinces of his empire into the form of 3 9-legged cauldrons, possessed of the magic power to ward off noxious influence, cause their contents to boil without fire, and generate spontaneously every delicacy. They became a sacred symbol of the imperial authority, were handed down carefully from dynasty to dynasty, but disappeared mysteriously on the fall of the Zhou, a circumstance extremely injurious to the prestige of Shi Huangti. The casting and decoration of bronze became one of the fine arts of China, and produced collections that required 42 volumes to catalogue them. It made vessels for the religious ceremonies of the government and the home, and transformed 1,000 varieties of utensils into works of art. Chinese bronzes are equaled only by the work of the Italian Renaissance, and there perhaps only by those gates of paradise which Ghiberti designed for the baptistry of Florence. The oldest existing pieces of Chinese bronze are sacrificial vessels recently discovered in Honan. Chinese scholars assign them to the Shang dynasty, but European connoisseurs give them a later, though uncertain, date. The earliest dated remains are from the period of the Zhou. An excellent example of these is the set of ceremonial vessels in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Most of the Zhou bronzes were confiscated by Shi Huangti, lest the people melt them down and recast them as weapons. With the accumulated metal, his artisans made 12 gigantic statues, each 50 feet high, but not 1 foot of the 50 remains. Under the Han, many fine vessels were made, often inlaid with gold. Artists trained in China cast several masterpieces for the Temple of Horyuji at Nara in Japan, the loveliest being 3 Amida Buddhas seated in lotus beds. There is hardly anything finer than these figures in the history of bronze. Under the Sung, the art reached its height, if not of excellence, certainly of fertility. Cauldrons, wine vessels, beakers, censers, weapons, mirrors, bells, drums, vases, plaques, and figurines filled the shelves of connoisseurs, and found some place in nearly every home. An attractive sample of Sung work is an incense burner in the form of a water buffalo mounted by Lao Tse, who bestrides it calmly in proof of the power of philosophy to tame the savage breast. The casting is throughout of the thinness of paper, and the lapse of time has given the piece a patina or coating of mottled green that lends it the meretricious beauty of decay. Patina, Latin for dish, is formed by the disintegration of the metal surface through contact with moisture or earth. It is the fashion today to value bronzes partly according to the green or black patina left on them by time, or by the acids used in the modern production of ancient art. Under the Ming, a slow deterioration attacked the art. The size of the objects increased and quality fell. Bronze, which had been a miraculous novelty in the Chalcolithic age of the Emperor Yu, became a commonplace and yielded its popularity to porcelain. Sculpture was not one of the major arts, not even a fine art to the Chinese. By an act of rare modesty, the Far East refused to class the human body under the rubric of beauty. Its sculptors played a little with drapery, and used the figures of men, seldom of women, to study or represent certain types of consciousness, but they did not glorify the body. For the most part, they confined their portraits of humanity to Buddhist saints and Taoist sages, ignoring the athletes and courtesans who gave such inspiration to the artists of Greece. In the sculpture of China, animals were preferred even to philosophers and saints. The earliest Chinese statues known to us are the 12 bronze colossi erected by Shi Huangti. They were melted by a Han ruler to make small cash. A few little animals in bronze remained from the Han dynasty, but nearly all the statuary of that epoch was destroyed by war or the negligence of time. The only important Han remains are the tomb reliefs found in Shantung. Here again the human figures are rare, the scenes being dominated by animals carved in thin relief. More akin to sculpture are the funerary statuettes of clay, mostly of animals, occasionally of servants or wives, which were buried with male corpses as a convenient substitute for sati. Here and there, animals in the round survive from this period, like the marble tiger, all muscle and watchfulness that guarded the temple of Xiangfu, or the snarling bears in the Gardner collection at Boston, or the winged and goitrous lions of the Nanking tombs. These animals, and the proud horses of the tomb reliefs, show a mixture of Greco-Bactrian, Assyrian, and Scythian influences. There is nothing about them distinctively Chinese. Meanwhile, another influence was entering China in the form of Buddhist theology and art. It made a home for itself, first in Turkestan, and built there a civilization from which Stein and Pelliot have unearthed many tons of ruined statuary. Some of it seems equal to Hindu-Buddhist art at its best. The Chinese took over those Buddhist forms without much alteration and produced Buddhas as fair as any in Gandhara or India. The earliest of these appear in the Yunkan cave temples of Shanxi, circa 490 A.D. Among the best are the figures in the Lungmen grottos of Honan. Outside these grottos stand several colossi, of which the most unique is the graceful Bodhisattva, and the most imposing is the Vairochana Buddha, circa 672 A.D., destroyed at the base but still instructively serene. Farther east in Shantung, many cave temples have been found whose walls are carved with mythology in Hindu fashion, with here and there a powerful bodhisattva like that in the cave of Yunmen, circa 600 A.D. The Tang dynasty continued the Buddhist tradition in sculpture and carried it to perfection in the seated stone Buddha, circa 639, found in the province of Shenxi. The later dynasties produced in clay some massive lohans, disciples of the gentle Buddha who have the stern faces of financiers, and some very beautiful figures of the Mahayana deity Kuan Yin, almost in the process of turning from a god into a goddess. After the Tang dynasty, sculpture lost its religious inspiration and took on a secular, occasionally a sensuous character. Moralists complained, as in Renaissance Italy, that the artists were making saints as graceful and supple as women, and Buddhist priests laid down severe iconographic rules, forbidding the individualization of character or the accentuation of the body. Probably the strong moral bent of the Chinese impeded the development of sculpture. When the religious motif lost its impelling force and the attractiveness of physical beauty was not allowed to take its place, sculpture in China decayed. Religion destroyed what it could no longer inspire. Towards the end of the Tang, the fount of sculptural creation began to run dry. The Sung produced only a few extant pieces of distinction. The Mongols gave their energies to war. The Mings excelled for a passing moment in bizarrerie and such colossi as the stone monsters that stand before the tombs of the Mings. Sculpture, choked by religious restrictions, gave up the ghost and left the field of Chinese art to porcelain and painting. 3. Pagodas and palaces. Chinese architecture, the porcelain tower of Nanking, the jade pagoda of Peking, the temple of Confucius, the temple and altar of heaven, the palaces of Kublai Khan, a Chinese home, the interior, color and form. Architecture, too, has been a minor art in China. Such master builders as have labored there have hardly left a name behind them, and seem to have been less admired than the great potters. Large structures have been rare in China, even in honoring the gods. Old buildings are seldom found, and only a few pagodas date back beyond the 16th century. Sung architects issued in 1103 A.D. 8 handsomely illustrated volumes on the method of architecture, but the masterpieces that they pictured were all of wood, and not a fragment of them survives. Drawings in the National Library at Paris, purporting to represent the dwellings and temples of Confucius's time, show that through its long history of over 23 centuries, Chinese architecture has been content with the same designs and the same modest proportions. Perhaps the very sensitivity of the Chinese in matters of art and taste made them forego structures that might have seemed immodest and grandiose, and perhaps their superiority in intellect has somewhat hindered the scope of their imagination. Above all, Chinese architecture suffered from the absence of 3 institutions present in almost every other great nation of antiquity: an hereditary aristocracy, a powerful priesthood, and a strong and wealthy central government. These are the forces that in the past have paid for the larger works of art, for the temples and palaces, the masses and operas, the great frescoes and sculptured tombs. And China was fortunate and unique. She had none of these institutions. For a time the Buddhist faith captured the Chinese soul, and sufficient of China's income to build the great temples whose ruins have been so lately discovered in Turkestan. Buddhist temples of a certain middling majesty survive throughout China, but they suffer severely when compared with the religious architecture of India. Pleasant natural approaches lead to them, usually up winding inclines marked by ornate gateways called pai lus, and apparently derived from the rails of the Hindu topes. Sometimes the entrance is spiritually barred by hideous images designed, in one sense or another, to frighten foreign devils away. One of the best of the Chinese Buddhist shrines is the Temple of the Sleeping Buddha, near the Summer Palace outside Peking. Ferguson called it the finest architectural achievement in China. More characteristic of the Far East are the pagodas that dominate the landscape of almost every Chinese town. Their origin, in name and fact, is in much dispute. The word may be taken from the Hindu-Persian term Butgada, house of idols. The form may be indigenous to China, as some think, or may be derived from the spire that crowned some Hindu topes. Like the Buddhism that inspired them, these graceful edifices took over some of the superstitions of popular Taoism and became centers not only of religious ceremony but of geomantic divination. That is, the discovery of the future by the study of lines and clefts in the earth. Communities erected pagodas in the belief that such structures could ward off wind and flood, propitiate evil spirits, and attract prosperity. Usually they took the form of octagonal brick towers rising on a stone foundation to 5, 7, 9, or 13 stories, because even stories were unlucky. The oldest standing pagoda is at Sung Yue Su, built in 523 A.D. on the sacred mountain of Sungshan in Honan. One of the loveliest is the pagoda of the Summer Palace. The most spectacular are the Jade Pagoda at Peking and the Flask Pagoda at Wu Taishan. The most famous was the Porcelain Tower of Nanking, built in 1412-31, distinguished by a facing of porcelain over its bricks, and destroyed by the Taiping Rebellion in 1854. The fairest temples of China are those dedicated to the official faith at Peking. The Temple of Confucius is guarded by a magnificent Pai Lu, most delicately carved, but the temple itself is a monument to philosophy rather than to art. Built in the 13th century, it has been remodeled and restored many times since. On a wooden stand in an open niche is the tablet of the soul of the most holy ancestral teacher Confucius, and over the main altar is the dedication to the master and model of 10,000 generations. Near the south Tatar wall of Peking stand the Temple of Heaven and the Altar of Heaven. The altar is an impressive series of marble stairs and terraces, whose number and arrangement had a magical significance. The temple is a modified pagoda of 3 stories, raised upon a marble platform and built of unprepossessing brick and tile. Here at 3 o'clock in the morning of the Chinese New Year, the emperor prayed for the success of his dynasty and the prosperity of his people, and offered sacrifice to a neuter, but it was hoped not neutral, heaven. However, the temple was badly damaged by lightning in 1889. More attractive than these stolid shrines are the frail and ornate palaces that once housed princes and mandarins at Peking. A burst of architectural genius during the reign of Cheng Tzu, 1403 to 1425, reared the Great Hall at the tombs of the Ming emperors and raised a medley of royal residences in an enclosure destined to become known as the Forbidden City, on the very site where Kublai Khan's palaces had amazed Marco Polo 2 centuries before. Ogreish lions stand watch at either side of the marble balustrades that lead to the marble terrace. Hereon are official buildings with throne rooms, reception rooms, banquet rooms, and the other needs of royalty, and scattered about are the elaborate homes in which once lived the imperial family, their children and relatives, their servants and retainers, their eunuchs and concubines. The palaces hardly vary one from another. All have the same slender columns, the same pretty lattices, the same carved or lettered cornices, the same profusion of brilliant colors, the same upward-curving eaves of the same massively tiled roofs. And like these forbidden delicacies is the second summer palace, some miles away, perhaps more completely perfect of its kind, more gracefully proportioned and fastidiously carved than the once royal homes of Peking. If we try to express in brief compass the general characteristics of Chinese architecture, we find as a first feature the unpleasant wall that hides the main structure from the street. In the poorer sections, these outer walls are continuous from home to home and betray an ancient insecurity of life. Within the wall is a court, upon which open the doors and lattices of one or several homes. The houses of the poor are gloomy tenements, with narrow entrances and corridors, low ceilings, and floors of the good earth. In many families, pigs, dogs, hens, men and women live in one room. The poorest of all live in rain-swept, wind-beaten huts of mud and straw. Those with slightly better incomes cover the floor with mats or pave it with tiles. The well-to-do adorn the inner court with shrubs and flowers and pools, or surround their mansions with gardens in which nature's wild variety and playful sports find assiduous representation. Here are no primrose paths, no avenues of tulip beds, no squares or circles or octagons of grass or flowers. Instead, precarious footways wind casually through rock-laid gullies over devious rivulets, and among trees whose trunks or limbs have been taught to take strange shapes to satisfy sophisticated souls. Here and there dainty pavilions, half hidden by the foliage, offer the wanderer rest. The home itself is not an imposing affair, even when it is a palace. It is never more than 1 story in height, and if many rooms are needed, the tendency is to raise new edifices rather than to enlarge the old. Hence, a palatial dwelling is seldom one united structure. It is a group of buildings of which the more important follow in a line from the entrance to the enclosure, while the secondary buildings are placed at either side. The favorite materials are wood and brick. Stone rarely rises above the foundation terrace. Brick is usually confined to the outer walls, earthen tiles provide the roof, and wood builds the decorative columns and the inner walls. Above the brightly colored walls, an ornamental cornice runs. Neither the walls nor the columns support the roof. This, heavy though it is, rests only upon the posts that form part of the wooden frame. The roof is the major part of a Chinese temple or home. Built of glazed tiles, yellow if covering imperial heads, otherwise green, purple, red, or blue, the roof makes a pretty picture in a natural surrounding, and even in the chaos of city streets. Perhaps the projecting bamboos of ancient tent tops gave the Far Eastern roof its graceful upward curve at the eaves, but more probably this celebrated form arose merely from the desire of the Chinese builder to protect his structure from rain. For there were few windows in China. Korean paper or pretty lattices took their place, and lattices would not keep out the rain. The main doorway is not at the gable end, but on the southern facade. Within the ornamented portal is usually a screen or wall barring the visitor from an immediate view of the interior, and offering some discouragement to evil spirits who must travel in a straight line. The hall and rooms are dim, for most of the daylight is kept out by the latticed openings and the projecting eaves. There are seldom any arrangements for ventilation, and the only heat supplied is from portable braziers, or brick beds built over a smoky fire. There are no chimneys and no flues. Rich and poor suffer from cold and go to bed fully clothed. "Are you cold?" the traveler asks the Chinese, and the answer is often, "Of course." The ceiling may be hung with gaudy paper lanterns, the walls may be adorned with calligraphic scrolls or ink sketches, or silk hangings skillfully embroidered and painted with rural scenes. The furniture is usually of heavy wood, stained to an ebony black, and luxuriantly carved. The lighter pieces may be of brilliant lacquer. The Chinese are the only Oriental nation that sits on chairs, and even they prefer to recline or squat. On a special table or shelf are the vessels used to offer sacrifice to the ancestral dead. In the rear are the apartments of the women. Separate rooms or detached buildings may house a library or a school. The general impression left by Chinese architecture upon the foreign and untechnical observer is one of charming frailty. Color dominates form, and beauty here has to do without the aid of sublimity. The Chinese temple or palace seeks not to dominate nature, but to cooperate with it in that perfect harmony of the whole which depends upon the modesty of the parts. Those qualities that give a structure strength, security, and permanence are absent here, as if the builders feared that earthquakes would stultify their pains. These buildings hardly belong to the same art as that which raised its monuments at Karnak and Persepolis, and on the Acropolis. They are not architecture as we of the Occident have known it, but rather the carving of wood, the glazing of pottery, and the sculpture of stone. They harmonize better with porcelain and jade than with the ponderous edifices that a mixture of engineering and architecture gave to India, Mesopotamia, or Rome. If we do not ask of them the grandeur and the solidity which their makers may never have cared to give them, if we accept them willingly as architectural cameos, expressing the most delicate of tastes in the most fragile of structural forms, then they take their place as a natural and appropriate variety of Chinese art, and among the most gracious shapes ever fashioned by men. 4. Painting. 1. Masters of Chinese painting. Ku Kai-chi, the greatest painter, wit and fool. Han Yu's miniature. The classic and the romantic schools. Wang Wei, Wu Tao-tse, Wei Tsung, the artist emperor. Masters of the Sung age. The Occident has been forgivably slow in acquainting itself with Chinese painting, for almost every aspect and method of the art in the East differed from its practice in the West. First, the paintings of the Far East were never on canvas. Occasionally they were wall frescoes, as in the period of Buddhist influence. Sometimes, as in later days, they were on paper, but for the most part they were on silk, and the frailty of this material shortened the life of every masterpiece, and left the history of the art with mere memories and records of accomplishment. Further, the paintings had an air of thinness and slightness. Most of them were in watercolor and lacked the full-bodied and sensuous tints of European pictures in oil. The Chinese tried oil painting, but seemed to have abandoned it as too coarse and heavy a method for their subtle purposes. To them, painting, at least in its earliest forms, was a branch of calligraphy or beautiful penmanship. The brush which they used for writing served them also for painting, and many of their chefs-d'oeuvre were drawn simply with brush and ink. Though writing is in its origin a form of drawing or painting, the Chinese classify painting as a form of writing and consider calligraphy or beautiful writing as a major art. Specimens of fine writing are hung on the walls in Chinese and Japanese homes, and devotees of the art have pursued its masterpieces as modern collectors roam over continents to find a picture or a vase. The most famous of Chinese calligraphers was Wang circa 400 A.D. It was on the Chinese characters as formed by his graceful hand that the characters were cut when block printing began. The great Tang Emperor, Dai Tsung, resorted to theft to get from Pian Tsai a scroll written by Wang Shiqi. Thereupon Pian Tsai, we are told, lost appetite and died. Finally, their greatest achievements were unconsciously hidden from Western travelers. For the Chinese do not flaunt their pictures on public or private walls. They roll them up and store them carefully away, and unfold them for occasional enjoyment as we take down and read a book. Such scroll paintings were arranged in sequence on a roll of paper or silk, and were read like a manuscript. Smaller pictures were hung on a wall, but were seldom framed. Sometimes a series of pictures was painted on a screen. By the time of the later Sung dynasty, the art of painting had already developed 13 branches and innumerable forms. Painting is mentioned in Chinese literature as an established art several centuries before Christ, and despite the interruptions of war, it has continued in China to our own time. Tradition makes the first Chinese painter a woman, Lei, sister of the pious Emperor Shun. "Alas," cried a disgusted critic, "that this divine art should have been invented by a woman." Nothing survives of Zhou painting, but that the art was then already old appears from Confucius's report of how deeply he was affected by the frescoes in the Grand Temple at Luoyang. During the early years of the Han Dynasty, a writer complained that a hero whom he admired had not been sufficiently painted. "Good artists are many. Why does not one of them draw him?" The story is told of an artist virtuoso of the time, Liei, who could draw a perfectly straight line 1,000 feet long, could etch a detailed map of China on a square inch of surface, and could fill his mouth with colored water and spit it out in the form of paintings. The phoenixes which he painted were so lifelike that people wondered why they did not fly away. There are signs that Chinese painting reached one of its zeniths at the beginning of our era, but war and time have destroyed the evidence. From the days when the Qin warriors sacked Luoyang, circa 249 B.C., burning whatever they could not use, down to the Boxer Uprising in 1900, when the soldiers of Tung Chou employed the silk pictures of the imperial collection for wrapping purposes, the victories of art and war have alternated in their ancient conflict. Destruction always certain, but creation never still. As Christianity transformed Mediterranean culture and art in the 3rd and 4th centuries after Christ, so Buddhism in the same centuries effected a theological and aesthetic revolution in the life of China. While Confucianism retained its political power, Buddhism, mingling with Taoism, became the dominating force in art and brought to the Chinese a stimulating contact with Hindu motives, symbols, methods, and forms. The greatest genius of the Chinese Buddhist school of painting was Ku Kai-chi, a man of such unique and positive personality that a web of anecdote or legend has meshed him in. He loved the girl next door and offered her his hand, but she, not knowing how famous he was to be, refused him. He painted her form upon a wall and stuck a thorn into the heart, whereupon the girl began to die. He approached her again, and she yielded. He removed the thorn from his picture, and forthwith the girl grew well. When the Buddhists tried to raise money to build a temple at Nanking, he promised to fund 1 million cash. All China laughed at the offer, for Ku was as poor as an artist. "Give me the use of a wall," he asked. Having found a wall and secured privacy, he painted there the Buddhist saint Vimalakirti. When it was finished, he sent for the priests and explained to them how they might raise the 1 million cash. "On the first day you must charge 100,000 cash for admission to see the picture. On the second day 50,000. On the third day let visitors subscribe what they please." They did as he told them and took in 1 million cash. Ku painted a long series of Buddhist pictures, and many others, but nothing certainly his has come down to our day. The British Museum assigns to him a faded but lovely scroll of 5 pictures illustrating model family life. The temple of Confucius at Chufu contains a stone engraving purporting to follow a design of Ku, and the Freer Gallery at Washington contains 2 excellent copies of compositions attributed to him. He wrote 3 treatises on painting, of which some fragments survive. Men, he said, were the most difficult things to paint. Next came landscapes, then horses and gods. He insisted on being a philosopher, too. Under his portrait of the emperor, he wrote, "In nature there is nothing high which is not soon brought low. When the sun has reached its noon, it begins to sink. When the moon is full, it begins to wane. To rise to glory is as hard as to build a mountain out of grains of dust. To fall into calamity is as easy as the rebound of a tense spring." His contemporaries ranked him as the outstanding man of his time in 3 lines: in painting, in wit, and in foolishness. Painting flourished at the Tang court. "There are as many painters as morning stars," said Tu Fu, "but artists are few." In the 9th century, Jiang Yan Yuan wrote a book called Eminent Painters of All Ages, in which he described the work of 370 artists. A picture by a master, he tells us, brought in those days as much as 20,000 ounces of silver. But he warns us against rating art in monetary terms. Good pictures, he writes, are more priceless than gold or jade. Bad ones are not worth a potsherd. Of Tang painters, we still know the names of 220. Of their work, hardly anything remains, for the Tatar revolutionists who sacked Chang'an in 756 A.D. did not care for painting. We catch something of the art atmosphere that mingled with the poetry of the time in the story of Han Yu, the famous prince of literature. One day he won from a fellow lodger at an inn a precious miniature portraying, in the smallest compass, 123 human figures, 83 horses, 30 other animals, 3 chariots, and 251 articles. I thought a great deal of it, for I could not believe that it was the work of a single man, uniting as it did in itself such a variety of excellences, and no sum would have tempted me to part from it. Next year I left the city and went to Hoyang, and there one day, while discussing art with strangers, I produced the picture for them to see. Among them was a Mr. Chow, a censor, a highly cultivated man, who, when he saw it, seemed rather overcome, and at length said, "That picture is a copy, made by me in my youth, of a work from the Imperial Gallery. I lost it 20 years ago while traveling in the province of Fukien." Han Yu at once presented the miniature to Mr. Chow. Just as in Chinese religion 2 schools had taken shape, Confucian and Taoist Buddhist, and just as 2 schools led by Chuxi and Wang Ming were soon to develop in philosophy, representing respectively what we in the West would call the classic and the romantic types of mind, so in Chinese painting the northern artists accepted a stern tradition of classical sobriety and restraint, while the South gave color and form to feeling and imagination. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.